Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Montreal Comic Arts Festival on a virtual Sunday afternoon. My name is Ian McGillis. I'm a books columnist for the Montreal Gazette, writing about all manner of literature and graphic literature whenever I get a chance. It's one of my passions. So it's great to talk to you all today and meet you, if only virtually. So my interviewees today are David Daneman of the Daneman Comics fame. He's going to have some interesting things to say, I think, on the
no promises.
And the whole question of text and visuals and that balance in graphic literature, which is something that's always fascinated me. We've also got Tracy Hurren, senior editor at Montreal Graphic Lit, Giant Drawn and Quarterly. And Andrew, is it Benteau, Andrew?
Benteau, yeah.
Andrew Benteau of the Toronto-based publisher Black Panel Press. So the question that we're addressing today, it's one that could range very, very broadly. So it'll probably be a matter of zeroing in on certain aspects of it. The question is, what ingredients make for a successful graphic novel? I suppose off the bat, we should define successful, whether we're talking commercially successful, artistically successful, or more likely some combination thereof. So I don't know. I guess whoever wants to jump in with this first can. What comes to your mind when you see those words, successful graphic novel? Andrew, how about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, that's kind of the first thing that came to my mind when with this question, as well as success obviously means something very different to each individual. But mainly, I think when we talk about film or any artistic endeavor, the success is to me divided in a critical success or a commercial success. That's the main two. I'm sure my colleagues here will add some opinions to that. But when we talk about commercial, is it financial success? And as some of us are publishers who are for profit, that's kind of how we would define that in. But we've also had books that will get amazing reviews and great reception from our audience. And although those might not sell as well, sometimes we also consider that a success. So I'd be looking forward to seeing what my colleagues here think about that.
Okay, David, how about you?
Yeah, commercial and critical are usually two of the main ways people would talk about success. I guess I would add also longevity, that a book which is considered good when it comes out, or a critical success, sometimes they kind of fade away. And I think that time is one of the best ways to determine what is generally considered to be of value.
As in any other artistic endeavor, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy, how about you, off the top of your head?
I think usually, like, when we're trying to define a successful book, it usually has a lot to do with like a idiosyncratic voice, and that coming through, of course, equally through images and pictures. And it's usually those books that kind of meet in the middle with being having that artistic integrity and also kind of breaking out and having a higher sales potential.
Do you think there's any risk at all in trying to second guess, especially the market? I mean, can you, in effect, plan for a commercial success, or is it more of a?
I think you can to some degree. It's especially if you're thinking about like different markets. Like, we can usually tell if a book will be successful in like the library market or the school market versus more like a mass literary market. I think you can totally plan for it, but you can't always count on it. Mm-hmm. A book will break out and you won't necessarily expect it.
Yeah, we can get to that later. You've had a couple of high-profile cases like that.
Yeah.
Andrew or David, any thoughts on that question?
Can you plan for it?
Well, you, David, for example, when you're creating something, do you have an ideal readership in mind, and do you have a sense of the size of that readership?
I guess what I was thinking when I heard the question was that a lot of what I do does have involves like maybe trend watching. And so can you plan for something? I don't personally know if I can, but I certainly do pay a lot of attention to what people like, what they're reading. And so it would be stupid to not pay attention to that and you know, perhaps show people like I collect a lot of comics. So if I see a lot of people doing one thing, then that's kind of something that I'm probably going to, you know, publish.
I think that, like my colleagues here, I don't think that it's, you can really definitively plan for success in the market, but there are things that you can do that traditionally in the publishing industry, I don't think have been adopted. And so there's an author of a graphic novel called Remind. Is anybody familiar with that? Remind? It was a self-published book. It's by Jason Brubaker, his name is. And he wrote an interesting book to accompany his process. And in it, he describes a way of kind of shortening the feedback loop with his audience, with his fans. So while he was developing the graphic novel Remind, he would publish one page at a time, build his audience, get feedback, you know, make changes, adapt. So, and in the end, I think the risk with that is, of course, you build something that's, you know, too commercial at that point. It's too like optimized for an audience. But in his case, I think he succeeded in making a graphic novel that was very close to his heart at the same time as getting that valuable feedback while he was making it. So in that case, you know, when he launched that book, I think it was over $100,000 on Kickstarter, self-published. By the time he did it without, you know, creating the entire book first, and you know, putting in maybe a year or 2 years of effort before having any feedback. So I think that kind of process is the best way to give yourself the best chance at success.
Do you think, and this is for any of you to answer, do you think that graphic lit and comics in general have an advantage over more conventional areas of literature in that sense that they can be more interactive with their audience and that they can maybe in effect road test their work before they commit to a full project? Is there anything in that?
Well, it's certainly easier to slap a comic strip up on Instagram than it is to like excerpt a novel. It's like a really easy thing for people to scroll past and consume and engage with. So in that sense, certainly. Or if you look at, you know, just online comics in general, the internet is a great way to share those. In a way, you can certainly put your writing on the internet, but I think it's a higher threshold to entry for people online that don't really have an attention span.
Which is more and more people probably.
Yeah, myself included.
Yeah. I'm guilty as charged. Any thoughts there, David?
I agree with Tracy. Comics have an advantage in that as a visual art form, they, you know, social media does lend itself to shorter attention spans. I think it would be very hard to try to give people a taste of a novel with the hopes of getting them to go on and read it. That being said, I guess Drawn Accordingly may have an opinion about like Michael DeForge's sort of work, where it is sort of this weird meeting of like web comics and graphic novels. So I don't, you guys would know better than I. How is that going with like testing out that sort of material?
I kind of feel in some ways like it's evolving. If like you look at our first example of that would have been Kate Beaton's Hark a Vagrant, which is now, I don't even know, maybe 8 years ago. And with that, we saw the internet working tremendously well because she built this huge online audience. And that book is one of our all-time bestsellers because of that, because it was published online first. And then, but that was its own kind of different wild beast. The internet was at a different phase now. And now everything's online, and I don't know if we see that exact same correlation between cultivating an online audience. The book is successful. With Michael DeForge's, particularly like Leaving Richard's Valley, which is we published last year, and the whole book was previously, he published it all on Instagram first. I think what I found interesting about that is similar to with Kate. The experience of reading the book was transformative from the online experience. And for me, reading Leaving Richards Valley on Instagram, it was great because you could read it and you could follow along. And the story was so fascinating that I think a lot of people did. And he gained a lot of fans through that. But for me, reading like a small comic, a tiny text on Instagram, it wasn't necessarily like fun or relaxing. So there was still like a ton of value in that book. And we tried to make that book like a really nice object too, to offer like something for the fans that had already consumed the book in its entirety online. They have this beautiful object. And we've always seen, we've never seen a sales drop from stuff being online first. If anything, I think you have an audience and you have a following and it only helps sales. Sometimes it helps them tremendously. Sometimes, it seems roughly the same or maybe a bit more, but we've definitely never seen it like tank a book or anything like that. So I'm usually a big supporter of online serialization.
You mentioned referred obliquely to the idea of the book as a sort of objet d'art, and it's always struck me that Graphic Lit is in a good position to ride out various storms in the publishing and the cultural world, in that it really is something you need to hold in your hand, and it can't really be duplicated on a screen, or I guess it can in some senses, but it's something that for me as a reader and a fan anyway, I don't really feel I've engaged with a graphic lit or graphic novel unless I actually have the physical book in my hands. Maybe I'm fetishizing or something, I don't know, but it does seem to me that that's a really crucial part of it.
I have the book Leaving Richards Valley, and it is a beautiful object. It's pretty. It's like 400 pages, and it's got this black and silver cover. So,
so on the subject of knowing your audience or knowing your readership, Andrew, would it be fair to say that you launched your company in response to a perceived gap in the North American market for the sort of thing you do?
Yeah, I would say so. That's right. Yeah, mainly we were inspired by the bande dessinée style of France in the beginning, and now it's kind of evolved a little bit to try to bring more kind of international culture and different kinds of international stories to North America, because it's still, we have great publishers like Drawn and Quarterly and Fantagraphics and all these are doing amazing work here. But the market still feels very much dominated by superheroes and things like that, which are great. But the medium, of course, has more diversity in it. So that's what we're trying to do, is bring some of that international flavor to North America. Yeah.
This might be a good point to get a little more granular on the subject of our discussion. That is the actual ingredients of a successful graphic novel. Can we talk about that we can talk about it in narrative terms, I suppose, also in formal terms, visual versus text, visual and text, and how they interact. Is there a sort of platonic ideal for that when you're putting a book together? Anybody feel free to jump in?
No, not necessarily. I mean, we haven't really scratched like what a graphic novel is a very difficult question, right? Like in my opinion, I feel like it has something to do with the length. That's about as much as I could tell you, is that like it's if it's too short, it's not a graphic novel. But beyond that, like when it comes to topicality, I don't really think that there's a lot of limits there. That you can do just about anything you want, and as long as it's of a certain length, it's a graphic novel.
Right.
Subject matter terms, you mean? Yeah. Yeah, when you think of some of the most iconic and high-profile graphic novels, it's hard to see any particular pattern across those books. I mean, you got everything from Mouse to Chris Ware, or you could roll out the usual big names. They all seem like kind of self-contained phenomenon, phenomenon to themselves.
I think all of those, like of the great graphic novels, the authors all have a very specific perspective on the world, and that's like married really nicely in their art style and the content. And if you look, across any successful graphic novel, I would say that is like the one through line that you can kind of count on. But yeah, as David was saying, beyond that, kind of anything goes, which is what makes comics so fun.
So in a sense, the through line is that there is no particular through line.
Yeah. Just a smart author.
Mm-hmm. When I guess we'll talk from a publishing standpoint here, is it usually more a case of you seeking out the writer or project, or people coming to you? Is there still a big is there as much of a pitching or submitting element in your branch of publishing as in, say, conventional fiction or nonfiction, where you have the classic idea of the big slush pile and things having to buck tremendous odds just to get seen?
I think that depends a lot on which publishing house you're talking about too. I mean, we're still pretty young. We're only 3 years old. We have 9 titles. So I read everything that comes through, and we don't get all that much, probably 3 or 4 a month. And I do have to look for people. I have to look for new projects sometimes. I'm sure that's very different from other publishers who are more established.
And would you say you have a house style, as it were, or do you look for certain things across all your titles?
Now, that's a really good question. I think we're still kind of developing a style of titles that we're, across our catalog. But generally, we kind of try to go towards a kind of a literary style, so complete stories with the beginning and end that have some kind of emotional resonance. It's a bit broad of a statement, but that's kind of what we go for.
Earlier, you said that you were inspired by the bande dessinée style of France, and I'm just wondering, can you explain what it was that you saw that then you wanted to import?
Sure. That's a good question, right? It's kind of hard to articulate that, for me, to be honest. But it's, in the French style, it's just kind of, there's more variety in artistic styles and the stories as well. I mean, you can have a story on any subject. It's mainly that, I think, that attracted me about the French bande dessinée style, and there's more stories written for adults as well, in that tradition, I find. Yeah.
Looking at your list, Andrew, I see a range from quite historical subjects, French Revolution, that sort of thing, to something fairly tropical, or not tropical, Freudian slip, topical, in, say, migrants from South and Central America,
Yes.
in the U.S. You've got the book that's on the banner behind you right now about the French painter Modigliani and
That's right.
his mistress subject. Yeah, so that's a pretty Catholic list you got there.
Okay, sure.
What else did I had a really clever question all lined up. And it
Sounds good.
in my head. David, do you want to talk a little about how you have approached the text versus visuals aspect in your work? You've got the Daneman series, which has been called silent comics, and that the visuals do pretty much all the lifting, and you tell the story through almost exclusively through the visuals.
Sure, I'm a recovering cartoonist. From 2005 to 2017, I was most active. I'm very infrequently active these days. But originally, I was a cartoonist, and I made a strip called The Daneman. Yeah. It's a strip. It's not like a graphic novel.
Right.
And in the strip, it's a very bizarre comic strip, but everybody in the strip looked exactly the same. They all looked like me, and they didn't talk. The strip itself was made out of photographs. So my philosophy on that was just that I studied film in university, and I liked Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin, and I just kind of emulated that when I was in film school. And comics were cheaper to make than film and less collaborative. So I kind of found my way into comics that way. So why silence? I guess one of the wonderful things about comics is we've probably all heard show, don't tell. And I kind of took that to heart when I was in school. And I just felt that like, if you could, do something without words, then you'd really done it. Mm-hmm. And I kind of pigeonholed myself for 12 years.
Would it be prying to ask why you stopped doing that a few years ago?
Well, I had a job with a South Korean company called Webtoon, and they paid me to make the comics 2 a week for 2.5 years, and I experienced significant burnout, not just with the workload, but also with the fan engagement, just like people, when you pour your heart into something and it's just not finding the audience, that hurts. But also when you have to keep doing it, like if no one were paying you, you could quit. Mm-hmm. But it was my job. And so I made these comics and it felt like nobody was reading them. It was a very bizarre world to live in where I'm making comics, being paid, and they're not really being seen by anybody. So when they let me go, I said, let's put the brakes on this. And then I started anthologizing gag strips. So these days I publish collections of other people's cartoons.
And do you find that process enjoyable in itself?
Yeah, I really love it. Andrew mentioned that there was sort of a gap in the market, and I felt that web cartoons are often like gag strips. They're kind of the children of what you might find in the newspaper or maybe even the New Yorker, short, funny comics. And that for whatever reason, nobody makes collections of these. And I thought, well, I know all the people and we ought to do this. So I stepped into the market, and we've done 3 books so far, and it's going pretty well. So
I just
feel free to
discovered your work.
The latest one is Block Party, is that it?
Block Party was the 3rd. That was the most recent one.
Oh, cool. Tracy, this might be a good moment, and it would certainly tie in with our theme, to maybe walk through the life of one of your most high-profile successes of recent years, and that's Nick Dernasso's Sabrina. What happened with that book? Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a lot to say about that book. For those not familiar with the book, it came out, I guess, about 2 years ago. And it's an amazing book. So, that's the backbone of why it was kind of a breakout success for us. It's about basically everything that's wrong with America, pre-COVID, of course. So it's a whole different world now. But it's about a young man and his girlfriend goes missing, and he kind of spirals as her whereabouts is unknown. And he ends up moving in with his friend in the South in America who works for the Army. And it kind of gets into false flag operations and conspiracy theories and that whole terrible situation where you have people denying the death of other humans. And
it's like the Sandy Hook truthers.
Exactly. So it was very inspired by Sandy Hook. So it was a very timely book. And then it was also nominated. It's the first graphic novel ever to be nominated for a Man Booker Prize. So it gained a ton of media attention because of that. And its success.
Sorry? But do you have any theories as to why it achieved that that recognition from that end of the literary culture where so many other graphic novels haven't, or none others have, really?
Well, I think it's like it was a very timely graphic novel, and it's very literary in its approach. A lot of people talk about Nick's work as being very like cinematic. So I think his art is also very clear and easy. There's nothing scratchy or messy about it that makes it hard for like a non-graphic novel reader to jump into. Mm-hmm. It's like a very low barrier to entry. So I think a lot of literary readers that maybe don't read that many graphic novels are able to pick up that book and understand what's going on immediately. which I think really speaks to the strength of his cartooning.
Mhm.
And I think also the Booker Prize was really kind of ready, I think, to highlight a graphic novel. A lot of these awards are really slow to do that,
Mhm.
which is too bad because it really, of course, helps with books and helps our industry be strong. And every time we see kind of a new award highlight a graphic novel, it makes a huge difference. So that was a really great moment for us and for Nick and for the success of his book. I see a question in the chat that
Okay.
is asking about if advertising has an influence on success, and I would say probably not. But things like awards like this, 100%. You can pay to take an ad out in a high-profile newspaper or online or whatever, and you might see a small bump, but it's not really going to have any effect on the success of your book, like an award would, or some other kind of high-profile reviews or attention.
Mhm. Off the top, at least a couple of you mentioned critical response and reviews. As a reviewer / critic myself, I like to think that if I write a prominent review, particularly a rave review, that it'll have some impact on a book
Yes.
and sales. Is that trackable? Can you?
Yeah. Usually, if it's like a smaller press hit, it's harder to see a direct correlation. But if we have like a New York Times book review or something, immediately we see a huge bump in sales. And we usually, the fastest way to see a sales bump is to look at your Amazon rating.
Right.
Whereas the rest of the sales data, it takes about a week to come in, but your sales ranking on Amazon is pretty immediate.
What we need is for Oprah to recommend a graphic novel.
Yeah.
Has she not done that?
I doubt it.
I think she has, but I'm not sure.
Oh.
But yes, that would be wonderful. Oprah, if you're watching.
For a differing opinion here, we found that we actually try to track every link that is posted on our reviewers' websites. But of course, as a smaller publishing house, so far we haven't had any big reviews in New York Times or anything like that. But for us, so far, it's actually been a pretty minimal source of customers, of readers, and mainly through advertising is actually the biggest draw of new readers for us. It's because mainly we're mainly online through our website and through Amazon and things like that at the moment, and kind of direct through comic book stores across the U.S. and Canada. But we find that without advertising, a book would never reach, some of the sales that some of our books have reached. Yeah, so it's a slightly different model. I think is the reason, right? And with time, I think with the right reviews, with the right press coverage, obviously, this is the best you can do for getting new readers, I think.
Well, again, I think it was touching on the critical success versus the commercial success. So, whereas advertising might be easier to sell more books, advertising might be harder to get better reviews,
Oh yeah, advertising doesn't do almost anything really for getting new reviews, right? So if we're talking about the commercial, yeah, absolutely, right?
But D&Q was talking about you might be able, if you put an ad somewhere, to get an award, and the award's going to get it reviewed. I don't know much about this, but it seemed like that was something we were talking about.
No. I wouldn't say advertising would ever lead to an award.
Okay.
No, maybe not.
Well, I was thinking like for your consideration ads,
Right. No, I mean, the way to get those in awards is to send your books in. Sometimes some awards you have to submit your books for them. Other awards, it's more like a panel that puts considerations forward.
What's the best award?
I don't know.
Eisner?
I'm curious. In your world, Ignatz?
No, I mean, of like the comic book awards, the Eisner Award is the one that it's probably the only one that really does much for sales. For something like the Ignatz, it's an honor and a nice award to achieve, but that's very like, you're kind of preaching to the choir at that point.
Fair enough.
People that are following the Ignatz Awards are already kind of following comics. So it doesn't necessarily correlate to a sales bump. It's just a nice honor for the cartoonist.
Is there a sense in which the rising tide helps every boat? You know, does
Sure.
high-profile success for one company do the whole genre a good deed?
I think so. I think like the success of Sabrina brought a lot of attention to Drama Quarterly and a lot of new readers. I was at the Brooklyn Book Festival the fall that book was really thriving, and because that's like a literary book festival, it's an interesting show because we always get a lot of new readers there. But specifically, we had just people coming to the booth all day saying, "I've never heard of Drama Quarterly, but I've heard of this book." And they'd be like, "What do you have?" And, you know, we'd sell them like a handful of books. And so definitely, one book winning an award, especially a graphic novel like that, I think that did a ton for the graphic novel industry in general, not just Drawn and Quarterly.
It seems to me that early in the life of this genre, something like Mouse by Art Spiegelman just did really an incalculable amount of good as far as just getting the layman's knowledge of the genre out there. And
I think it's often considered the first graphic novel, right?
Yeah.
May not be factually correct, but I think it's considered.
there's always been
attributed with making people realize that graphic novels were like a medium they should be paying attention to. And also the Pulitzer Prize, again, played a huge role in people realizing that book existed and that it was serious literature worth people's time.
I don't know about you guys, but I still, anytime, I still often get the comments, I don't read graphic novels. And people think that they're for children or for teenagers and things. And I always recommend to those people those two books, Mouse and Persepolis, to start with.
Right.
Because I find those immediately will give the idea that this is a serious form of literature.
Topicality, another subject that we've touched on at a couple of points. Maybe we can address it directly now. Can one sort of plan to be topical, or is the creative part of a book's life just too attenuated, too drawn out? Something that you might think is topical when you're working on it might be dated by the time you're done. I'm sure even as we speak, there are countless cartoonists working on their lockdown graphic novel, their COVID-19 graphic novel.
We've done a lot of submissions for COVID-19, lockdown memoirs.
Is that a good idea, do you think? Will it be a year from now? Will it be something people want to revisit? I mean, I guess you can't really predict these things, but
we still inside next year.
Yeah. I think there will be
time itself. Sorry?
I think there will be really interesting ways that COVID finds its way into graphic novels. Like we have one of my cartoonists, I was just emailing with her today because her book is, or this past week, her book kind of deals with, like she's doing a lot of traveling for interviews and stuff. So I was checking in to see how this was going to change the trajectory of her work. So it will play into the books, and now her book COVID will be a portion of the content. But actually sitting down and reading an entire book a year from now about someone's lockdown experience, I don't know that I necessarily am going to want to revisit this time. But also, I'm sure there's cartoonists that are going to find ways to successfully talk about it in a way that people do want to engage with.
And it's not like we won't still be living with the fallout a year from now or 10 years from now, for that matter.
One thing that I'll say is that cartooning itself has turned out to be a good industry to be in during a quarantine, in that film and television have been put on hold, the production, but comics can continue.
Yeah.
And book sales traditionally do really well during
recession,
terrible times. Not necessarily a recession. We're always still hit by a recession, but traditionally during wartime, or people are looking for something light and fun, which I think comics still have more of a perception of being that than proper literature.
Yeah, you've asked a couple of times, Ian, if we can plan for success.
Right.
And I just feel like you shouldn't, even if you can. I mean, it'd be great, but you don't plan for success. You hope for success.
The road to madness, I think, planning for success. Right?
Yeah. Also, I think that's a surefire way to make compromised work. That's not actually, your voice necessarily.
A lot of what D&Q does seem to be about people's, personal journeys and their true stories. Even if it is fiction, it's about their truth.
Yeah.
So if you tried to say, like, what do people want to read? You're not going to write your story.
No, it's just a lie then.
Yeah, if you write about the lockdown, it doesn't really affect you personally, then it's kind of just marketing at the point.
Yeah. Although speaking about like being topical, I would say like if you're talking more about how you're like collecting like online comics, I would think in like the webtoon world, COVID will be entering that in a very real way. If you're making comics in real time right now, I can't imagine not making it. Yeah, an aspect of it. So
it's too big a subject to just skip over.
You can't, you can't even write an email without acknowledging it. So
in these uncertain times.
Yeah.
Hey, I'm gonna have to try that.
Good one.
That's a good line.
Now, and this might be a little more general, but since I suspect some of our viewers, if not most of them, might be people hoping to break into this world to get published, perhaps for the first time, wonder if any advice could be offered, maybe in terms of classic beginners' mistakes to avoid, or just things to make sure you have a virtual or literal checklist of for submissions or for approaching a publisher. Anybody who wants to jump in?
I can take that one if you like, or Tracy.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I would just say, as a behavior, to kind of push yourself a little out of your comfort zone and show a willingness to get involved with promotion and talking about your work, because just it's true that a lot of our artists are very introverted, and can be difficult for them to get in front of a panel or do an interview online and things like that, or in person. But it's really important, at least for us. I'm sure maybe I'd like to hear what you have to say too, Tracy, but it's really important for us to have the artist following involved as well. And because there are large portions of our audience which are really just interested in the book, the art style, and they don't want to know. And there's other portions that really, they're only really interested in the artist and his or her process. And they buy the book because of that. And so some of our artists, are a little bit more reluctant and hesitant to get involved in that. But again, I would just say to those people to try to push yourself and learn those new skills, and make sure, try to be really self-aware about your, where you're weak, where you're strong, and try to play to your strengths, and show a willingness to be open to new ideas when it comes to promoting your book.
Tracy or David?
Going back just to your initial question, you asked about like submissions and kind of some how to do that properly. I would say
we don't have to be literal about that. We could go back right to the beginning of the creative process if you want.
Oh no, I just actually have some advice that I always share with people that I think is really good. That I actually learned in publishing school, and it's do your research about where you're submitting. At Drowning Quarterly, we get 10 submissions a day, sometimes more, sometimes less. And we do look through all of them, but luckily with comics, you don't have to read the whole thing to know whether it suits your house or not. But it's immediately clear when someone has done the research and knows who they're submitting to. And you're wasting your time and everyone else's time if you're submitting to the wrong publisher. So read the comics that the publisher publishes, and if yours is not anywhere, if you're doing like an adventure comic and you would never, or if you're writing like an adventure story and you're submitting it to like a poetry publisher, you never do that. It doesn't make any sense. And a lot of people will put in a lot of time submitting their comics to every comics publisher. Writing pitch letters, and it's it's not the best way to get anything published.
I can say as someone who's been an editor myself that there's no faster turnoff than the sense that someone has just done their submission across the board.
Yeah. And we can't possibly get back to everyone with how many submissions we get, but if someone has actually taken the time, they know who they're submitting to, they've kind of stated why their book makes sense for Drawn Quarterly, we get back to them, and we get back to as many people as we can. But definitely if someone has put the time in, we're much more likely to send them some feedback than if it's clear they're just submitting to every publisher.
For my 2 cents, I personally like when a story has like a beginning, middle, and an end. And I that's just my taste. I've seen a lot of good art that, deviates from like a traditional act structure. But I really am impressed when somebody knows how to tell a story. And so that always catches my eye. It's just like if the idea is interesting and then like it's clear they know where it's going. Again, I was a film student. A lot of rookies try to make a story about a person who's just kind of, trying to figure it out, or like they're going through something. There's not a lot of conflict. So when in doubt, add conflict. Read books about writing. Read. Actually, you can't write if you don't read. So make sure to read a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems obvious.
Show those things in your submission, right? Getting back to the submission, right? It's to show those qualities that you are well read, that you know how to create a story. Prove that in your submission, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do we have any questions from? I can't quite see that.
There's 3 in there. The first one says, "Does advertising influence the graphic novel's success a lot?"
Yes, we did. We addressed that one, I think.
All right, skip it then. The second one was about length. I had mentioned that I felt that one of the things that delineates graphic novels from other forms of graphic entertainment would be length, and the person asked specifically what length. So in your opinion, anybody want to hop on that?
That's a tricky one.
Yeah, I would say at the bare minimum, to have like a bound book that is being sold in stores, it usually needs to be at least 80 pages.
Sure.
Pagination is such a relative concept in the graphic lit world. You can have a giant sized Chris Ware book with a book's worth of information on a single page.
Yeah.
And you can have other books where it's the opposite end of that extreme. So
yeah.
I don't know. I guess I often think of like there's television and there's film. And so like a feature film is like 90 minutes. So my answer to how many pages? About 90 minutes at least. That makes any sense?
Andrew?
Nope.
Well, I'm hesitant to give an answer to that question, actually.
Yeah.
But I mean, I published a book that I would call a graphic novel. It's only 70 pages. I would call a book a graphic novel potentially if it had 50 pages. I don't know exactly how to articulate, from my perspective, what is a graphic novel, but it's something that accomplishes the same tasks to me as a novel. It has a theme, it has the character development, it has a beginning, middle, and an end. And if you can do that in 30 pages, maybe. I'm not sure. I've never seen something 30 pages that I'd call a graphic novel, but
Graphic novella.
maybe. I like it. But I would go, I like Tracy's too, because, something that less than 80 pages is a bit difficult to sell in bookstores, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on, what your company is. For Drawn Quarterly, we're like a pretty traditional trade publisher at this point. So it doesn't make sense for us to publish shorter works or pamphlets like we used to, but there's still a large audience for that. And I'm sure for other companies that fits into.
Yeah.
So there's a lot you can do with 40 pages.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't think we're all caught up with the labels and the terminology, right?
Yeah.
If we want to publish something, we don't care if they call it a comic or a graphic novel to some extent, at least, I'm sure you agree with that.
That was a conversation that took us years to get past the standard. What do we call this? I'd like to think we're mostly past that now.
Yeah. I use the word comic a lot. It feels like, what do you think, guys? Do people still shy away from that a lot, or?
I don't think people who love comics do.
No, right? But
Yeah.
I find that other people, when they're trying to, praise up the industry a little bit, they're kind of outsiders. They'll use graphic novel and they'll shy away from comic, which
Yeah.
I find a bit interesting.
Sometimes, depending on who I'm talking to, if I say comic, I can tell they don't really get what I do, and then I'll just say graphic novel, and then they'll know.
Okay.
So I definitely use comic in my regular vocabulary, and graphic novel when I'm trying to explain a bit.
Okay.
It's just unfortunate that comic book was already taken.
Yeah. That's true. It's the perfect,
the perfect answer was there all along. But I wonder if each of you could name your all-time or one of your all-time favorite graphic novels, and or pinpoint a work that first awakened you to this form, that first kind of set you alight. And
I'm going to go first. Mouse was the first one I ever read. I got it when I was like 11. That was the first graphic novel I ever read. But all-time favorite, probably Black Hole by Charles Burns. Because it scares the heck out. I can read it every year, and it's just so atmospheric. It's such a unique story. It's so scary, and it's so like you can kind of feel the time. I don't know. It's a wonderful work of literature, and it happens to be made with pictures as well.
I'll just jump in for a second with mine. It's actually a series of graphic novels, and now I'm blanking on the author's name. But it's the Aya series on Drawn and Quarterly, Tracy, the ones that are set in the Ivory Coast. About
yeah. It's a wonderful series. Yeah, they're so like dramatic and soap opera like in their scope and the range of the characters and the time that they follow those lives.
Well, just so visually sumptuous, and you learn all you need to know about the country just by looking at the details in each panel, I find.
Yeah, that series is by Marguerite Aboué for,
of course,
anyone interested.
Aya, A-Y-A.
Yeah.
Okay, Andrew?
I would say, well, I mean, it was really, I got to give some credit where it's due to Marvel, because the first I can't call it a graphic novel. It was a trade paperback that I bought, was Ultimate Spider-Man. I think it was volume 6. And so that was what really got me into comics in general. So I have to give that some credit. But just like David, Mouse, I think, was the first true graphic novel. I was lucky to have an English professor in university that insisted that they were a legitimate form of literature. And so she prescribed Mouse for the class. And that's kind of what got me hooked into those more serious graphic novels.
Tracy?
Yeah, I think I remember a very early graphic novel. I think it was maybe the first Drawn and Quarterly book I read was Jar of Fools by Jason Lutz. And that really, I think, got me thinking about working at Drawn and Quarterly. But Persepolis was a really early graphic novel I read. Also, and I can't tell you my favorite, every Drawn and Quarterly book is my favorite graphic novel.
Of course, they're all tied for number one, right?
Exactly. They're all my babies.
Mm-hmm.
If I'll hold up one that's sitting right beside me that is currently a top fave. That's in stores now. I Know You Rider by Leslie Stein, which is a beautiful, touching memoir about reproduction and reproductive rights and what it means to have children or not have children. And it just came out, and it's really lovely.
It's not a book that's really heavy on text, right? It's
no, Leslie's style. It's very kind of dreamy and floaty. You can see. Yeah, there's a lot of words in this one, but it's it's balanced out by a lot of space, and it's lovely.
So how are we for time then? It must be.
One thing we never discussed as a quality of a successful graphic novel is whether or not the artist is satisfied with it.
Right.
I think one measure of success would be if the person who created it felt that it was successful, if they were happy.
I'm never happy.
Yeah, in my experience, the artist isn't always necessarily the best judge of that.
But
War sketch.
it would
Occasionally
be.
they're happy, and that is really thrilling as an editor.
I think you've just described a lot of artists.
Yeah.
Unhappy but proud.
Okay.
Okay, the question was, what ingredients make for a successful graphic novel? And David Daneman, where can people find out more about you?
I'll just go with that part. My name is David Daneman. You can find me on Instagram at the Daneman. I think we have links to, I can't see the links anymore, but if you go to Instagram with Daneman, you can find me and all of my beautiful books. You can read wonderful comics. Instagram, the Daneman.
Andrew?
So my name is Andrew Benteau. I'm editor at Black Panel Press, and you can just go to blackpanelpress.com or just Black Panel Press and Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook.
And I'm Tracy Hurren, and I'm an editor at Drawn and Quarterly. You can find us online at Drawn and Quarterly on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And we have 2 stores in Montreal that are doing online orders right now. Currently doing bike delivery and delivery throughout all of Canada. And I believe starting on Wednesday, we'll be doing curbside pickup. So 5 books. Yeah.
I'll remember that.
Yes. Yeah, it'd be much nicer for the neighborhood to be able to walk over and pick up their stuff.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for viewing.
Thanks, everyone.
Look
Thanks for the
forward
festival.
to seeing you in person next year, hopefully.
Yeah.
Have a good
Yeah. MCAF 2021.